Chair, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to return to deliver this lecture entitled More Snapshots from the Stornoway Archive. Tonight I'll be referring again to some of the subjects covered in the previous lecture in March. I'll be looking at some of them from a slightly different perspective. And in addition, I'll be introducing a lot of new themes and topics, which I hope you'll find interesting. As before, I'm using the PowerPoint, the Windows Photo Viewer instead of PowerPoint, and that allows me to zoom in on specific sections of an image. At the start of the previous lecture, I showed this image of an oil painting dated 1798 by James Barrett. However, in the same year, Barrett completed another oil painting of Stornoway, entitled The Village of Stornoway with a Shooting Lodge on the Isle of Lewis. The painting, which I believe is still owned by the Aline Estate in Harris, was exhibited at Museum Nanylan in 2003. The artist was positioned on Gallows Hill, showing the harbour at sunset, looking in a northeasterly direction over the inner harbour of Stornoway. There are several items of interest which I would like to pick out. Murloc Hill, Seaforth Lodge, the tower-like structure which you see on Daniel's engraving of 1819, St. Columba's Church, built in 1794, and right at the end of what does appear now, the ruins of the old Stornoway Castle. But I'd also like you to focus on this little triangle here. This little triangle here is the estuary of the Shoeburn, and we will be returning to the Shoeburn in a wee while. In the print by William Daniel, we can see the same tower that I referred to a few moments ago. Officially, the actual print work is undated, although it was first published in 1819. Research into the travels of Daniel reveals that in the months of July and August 1815, he journeyed round the islands of Egg, Rum, Skye, Rasay, Harris, Lewis, Orkney, and proceeded down the east coast of Scotland as far south as Dundee. These journeys resulted in the gradual release and publication of 139 aquatint prints. And here is another version of the same one, this time in colour. Also, last March, we had a look at the 1846 sketch by Hans Busk, and we debated whether this view is roughly from the end of Kenneth Street or from the end of New Street. The preferred option then was the end of New Street. This additional image, definitely looking from the end of New Street, is very similar to the location of the Hans Busk sketch and would tend to confirm that the end of New Street is indeed the correct option. Let's have another look. And now, as promised, I return to the Shoeburn Glen. Back in March, we looked at this section of this map. We looked in particular at Lewis Castle and the circular pond. But tonight I would like to move over and concentrate on these buildings here. Not much detail is written about this area, this site in the 1800s. But I found a good account in a book entitled The Wee Scotch Whisky Tales by Ian Mitchell. No relation, Ian. Stuart Mackenzie, the book says that Stuart Mackenzie set up a legal distillery, buying surplus grain from the peasants and receiving the money back from them as rent, turning the produce of the peasants into a profitable enterprise. The locality had plenty pure water, good peat, and surplus barley. Intent on expanding the profitability of the enterprise, Mackenzie poured £14,000 into the venture. In 1833, the Reverend John Cameron records in the New Statistical Account of Scotland, and I quote, "There is a distillery on a grand scale with coppers of large diameter, furnaces, vats, coolers on a running stream, also a very large malt barn and mill. The grain can be received from ships at the barn door. Vessels can be either loaded or unloaded with the greatest convenience and expedition. The whole premises are constructed upon the most improved plans. It must have cost thousands of pounds to complete such a perfect model. No expense has been spared by the spirited proprietor to make it complete." And that's the end of the quote. The works were situated at the Shoeburn in the castle grounds. Mr. Thomas MacNee was engaged as the chief distiller, and he became a very well-liked fellow in the town, mainly due to the size of the drams that he dispensed to the townsfolk and sailors who came to buy whisky at the distillery. The Stornoway Gazette states that the Shoeburn distillery closed around the time Matheson bought Lewis in 1844. Furthermore, this Admiralty chart of Stornoway, survey date 1846, publication date 1849, already names the buildings on that site as stable and mill. Note here that the Shoeburn estuary is still in its natural state, with the end of the large malt barn near the high water mark, possibly built on stilts to facilitate the unloading and loading of cargoes. But there's a dispute about the date, because the content of the diary of John Munro Mackenzie, the State Chamberlain, is interesting. It states that in 1854, expansion of the distillery was in fact keynote, and reference is again made to the same chief distiller, Thomas MacNee, with the distillery continuing well into the 1850s. It further states that Matheson, although a strong advocate of temperance, may have profited from whisky distillation in Stornoway for some time after his purchase of the island, until, and it says 1857, he had the works demolished and replaced by stables. So it's another interesting historical debate in terms of the date, in my opinion. The front building, the malt barn, was totally demolished, leaving a lawned area in front of the back building, which became a store and work base for employees in the grounds and later the sawmill of the Stornoway Trust. I had a stitched photographic image by John MacLean of Upper Call, and it was probably one of the last of the old sawmill before its demolition. A stitched photographic image is made up of several camera shots and is used when the photographer cannot get far enough away from the target in order to get everything into the photo. So several shots are taken and then stitched or butted together. I am indebted to Andrew McAvoy, architect of Retool Architecture Glasgow, and John MacLean of Upper Call for approving the use of images tonight. Andrew was the principal architect for the Woodland Centre project, and in his design he used the east long wall of the sawmill as a spine on which to rest the timber frame, thereby retaining a functional link with the buildings of the past. It was in 2000 that work started on the construction of the Woodland Centre, incorporating some of the ancient walls from the previous structures on the site. In addition to Andrew McAvoy's leadership on the design, Colin Macaulay of Sordale was involved in the civil engineering survey work, and the extensive woodwork in the centre was completed by Peter Dyer. My next topic is Emigration, 1923-24. It's very unfortunate that I don't have the images here, because without the images, the text doesn't say very much. This was the stitched photographic image that I mentioned. This was the wood frame resting on the east long wall. There's another image of the wood frame resting on the east long wall. And that was the Woodland Centre when it opened in 2002. Now, my next topic is Emigration, 1923-24. And this is an image of the most famous of the emigration ships, the Metagama. Departure from Prince's Dock, Glasgow, 16th March 1923, took on 307 passengers at Stornoway, bound for St. John's, New Brunswick. This is another image of the Metagama. I suspect this one may be in Liverpool, with a possible outline of one of the towers of the Royal Liver building on the far left. Here we see friends and relations packed onto number 1 wharf at Stornoway, waving their goodbyes as the tender Hebrides moves away, taking emigrants to the Metagama, which was anchored in Stornoway Harbour. On any occasion when emigration from Stornoway is discussed, this photo says a lot about the interest in and the impact of the events at that time, and there appears to be little action taken with regard to health and safety. I'm indebted to Norman Mackenzie of Kyo's and now of Sandwich, and he's here tonight, for donating some of the following images to the archive. This one shows some of the emigrants aboard the McBrain boat Hebrides in April 1923, which acted as a tender from number 1 wharf to the Metagama, which was anchored in Stornoway Harbour, and Stornoway Pipe Band plays aboard the tender. Emigrants with their luggage adjacent to the old fish market in Stornoway before boarding the tender to take them out to the Metagama. On the top right corner, you can see the Caledonian Hotel in the background. The second ship involved in emigration from Lewis to Canada was the Murloc. This one came to Stornoway on the 25th of April 1924 and took on 288 passengers. She was bound for Quebec and Montreal. This is the Murloc leaving Stornoway. There was a large crowd on the pier at Stornoway to see the emigrants off on their voyage to Canada. Stornoway emigrants waving their farewells aboard the tender vessel SS Glendun, which ferried them out to the Murloc. More Stornoway emigrants aboard the tender vessel SS Glendun. The pipers play on the pier at Stornoway during embarkation of emigrants onto the tender. More emigrants on board the tender SS Glendun, waving farewells to friends on the pier. A piper leads the emigrants before they board the tender. However, this photograph is not recognisable as Stornoway and may have been taken in Loch Boisdale, South Uist, where additional emigrants boarded the Murloc. A crowd of residents left on the pier during the emigration. The expression of sadness etched on their faces is clear for all to see. And once again, this is not immediately recognisable as Stornoway and could be Loch Boisdale. A nurse speaks to an adult and children from the Outer Hebrides on board the Murloc. And this is the last step an emigrant prepares to go on the gangway. And the third ship was the SS Canada. Passengers embarked at Stornoway totaled 258. She left on the 17th of May 1924, bound for Quebec and Montreal. This is a very old photo of the sail loft building, taken around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. As you can see, the name board says Fisherman's Recreation Room. Fishermen would meet in the building to relax, have a chat, and make use of the reading room. The sail loft building is thought to have been built around 1800. But in the William Daniel engraving of 1819 referred to earlier, There is no large building which stands on this location. Furthermore, the existence of the building is not clearly confirmed on John Wood's plan of 1821. There is a site shown, but there is no building hatched in to confirm a structure. And our distinguished colleague, the late Frank Thompson, located an April 1835 edition of the Saturday magazine, published by the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and it held an image of Stornoway with a building which could well be the sail loft. Frank mentions this debate about the date, and he finishes with the words, "Shall we ever know for sure?" The next 6 images relate to the impressive artwork undertaken to refurbish the walls of the morning room in Lewes Castle. The first 2, that's a previous one and this one, are enlarged extracts from glass slides by George Washington Wilson. These slides are held in the Photographic archive at Aberdeen University. The archive holds a large number of images of the Western Isles and of Stornoway in particular. The selection available for viewing online is well worth a look. The fern-like plant murals on the walls of the morning room were considered to be excellent examples of the visual history of Lewes Castle, and as such they merited meticulous restoration by skilled artists. Perched up on platforms for weeks on end, using only small craft knives and small brushes, 2 artists employed by the contractor set about the task of restoring the colour murals, replicating colours and designs from what remained on the walls, together with comparison of the tones in the black and white George Washington Wilson glass plate images. In parts of the murals, there was considerable damage sustained by wall-mounted fitments over the years, and the restoration task was extremely demanding. You can see here the part of the wall which had been replastered after removal of a wall-mounted fitment or maybe a piece of shelving. And I actually took the last 3 photographs, this one and the previous 2, in December 2014. This image, although a bit blurred, is shown with the permission of the TripAdvisor website and gives you an impression of the final outcome. And this room is only one of the many beautiful pieces of major restoration in this magnificent building. I now move outside the castle into the grounds. The year is 1919, and William Hesketh Lever is already on the scene. The original of this image is held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the copy was sourced by Jessie Murray from the Society Committee. It represents a sketch plan by Sir Edwin Lutyens for a hotel in the castle grounds. The Dictionary of Scottish Architects and Buildings states that the project never got past the initial sketch planning stage. Research by my Society colleague Willie Fulger reveals that Sir Edwin Lutyens and James Lomax Simpson visited Lord Leverhulme at Lewes Castle in 1919 to discuss his proposal to build a hotel in the castle grounds. Lutyens appears to have been in a constant bad mood. Although he drew the sketch, he was not keen on the idea and had not wanted to come to Stornoway in the first place. He had annoyed Leverhulme with his comments and attitude, and was further not endeared to Leverhulme by his style of wit and humour. It is not clear exactly what role Leverhulme's Port Sunlight architect, James Lomax Simpson, had in the whole episode, but the hotel project went no further. This is the building known as the Cottage, between St Columba's Church and Barvis Lodge, at the top of Church Street. The image is one of 2 donated to the Society by Jean MacDonald of Keith Street, via John Norman MacDonald, a committee member. The cottage was built and occupied by Sir James and Lady Matheson in the late 1840s, while Lewes Castle was being constructed. In the late 1800s, through the turn of the century into the 1900s, it was occupied by Dr. Donald MacDonald and his wife, Dr. Amy May MacDonald, maiden surname Weir. Now, could you remember the surname Weir? Because I'll be coming back to that surname in a wee while. From 1910, it became the residence of Dr. Donald Murray, later to become the first MP for the Western Isles in 1918, after which, in the 1920s, it housed the offices of the Lewis and Harris Welfare and Development Company of Lord Leverhulme. Now, you notice I've said the first MP for the Western Isles in 1918. This has got to do with constituency boundaries. The first general election involving the Western Isles as a defined constituency took place soon after World War I in December 1918, and prior to that time we were part of the constituency with the name Ross and Cromarty, or in some records Ross and Cromarty Shire. So, back to the cottage. After the alterations to the building in 1928, it opened its doors as the Elizabeth Haldane Hostel. The building was demolished to make way for a new 3-storey hostel in 1967. Following the restructuring of secondary education and the construction of new 6-year schools in the Western Isles, the need for hostel accommodation in Stornoway was gradually reducing, and the building became an annex of the Council's Education Department. And so the Haldane Centre, as it was called, became known as the best venue in town for office parties, and I can personally vouch for that. The housing development Elizabeth Haldane Court, completed in 2009, now occupies the site. When we met last in March, we had a look at the original town hall, and this is the original picture again, a three-floor building opened by Lord Rosebery in 1905, foundation stone laid in 1903, destroyed by fire in 1918, and replaced by the equally impressive structure which we now have in Stornoway. However, in relation to the original building and its similar successor, I do believe correct decisions were made in the choice of design. Let us now have a look at what we might have got. As I show you these images, which are impressions of the proposed alternative buildings, I wish to quote directly from the submissions by the planners to the Building Committee of the Borough of Stornoway in 1902. These documents run into 22 pages in total from 2 separate planning companies and are in very fragile condition. Messrs. The Building Committee for the Borough of Stornoway, Public Library, Municipal and Town Hall buildings. Gentlemen, in compliance with your invitation, the designer has pleasure in submitting for your examination these plans prepared for your new Town Hall and library buildings. In doing so, permit us to assure you of the gratification your invitation has afforded him, and to state that no pains have been spared to make such designs as shall justify you in including his name among those architects whom you have invited to compete for the important building you propose to erect in Stornoway. The work is a most considerable one, and when finished, cannot fail to be a landmark and embellishment on the town. I really think you'll agree that we've got a good deal with the town hall we've got, compared to some of these, one of which was described to me as something out of a Harry Potter film. The next 2 photographs were donated by Mr. Roderick Murray. The Society has thanked Mr. Murray for these photos, and I take this opportunity tonight to repeat these thanks publicly. The photos will feature in our next edition of SY Gone By, and they show the buildings in HMS Mentor in 1943 on the Castle Green. They are the best photos we have seen of HMS Mentor. During World War II, the Lewes Castle and its immediate surroundings became a base for air and ground crew of 700 Naval Air Squadron, who operated a detachment of Supermarine Walrus aircraft from the slipway at Curry Point. If you walk to the right side of Curry Point, you'll see the base of a rectangular building, and that's the first image I've ever seen of the rectangular building, presumably a store or something to do with the base at Curry Point. And just to the left of that, there's a crane-like contraption We don't exactly know what it is, but we speculate that the crane contraption beside the building may have been used to pull the floating aircraft in the water towards the shore before they were towed up the slipway. The HMS Mentor building on the right-hand side there, on the right-hand side of the whole vista, is actually the cookhouse. Now here's an interesting point here. This photograph was taken in 1959, and it shows 3 British European Airways aircrew on the pier looking across at the castle. This photo, as I say, is 1959, and the main clearance of the Castle Green was tidied up by 1956 in preparation for the Queen's visit. However, this single building, the old cookhouse, remained. Why? What was it used for at that time? The best guess is a Ross and Cromarty County Council store. And if any people present tonight have any ideas, the Society would be interested to hear from you at the end of this talk. This photograph is of the Royal Naval Reserve at Drill, on ground behind the houses on the sea side of Seaview Terrace. The Seaview Terrace houses were completed in 1874, and they were used by the regulars of the Royal Naval Reserve from that year. There is a clue to the approximate date of the photo. On the far right, in the distance, here, we can see the clock school, the original building of the Nicholson Institute, and we can also see the clock tower. And that means the photo is after 1902, but the image is not clear enough to confirm if there are clock faces on the tower, because these were put in place in 1905. There's an interesting historical link between this gentleman and the Royal Naval Reserve. This gent is James Galloway Weir. And remember, I mentioned Weir when I was talking about the cottage. He was the father of Dr. Amy May MacDonald, to whom I referred in my coverage of the cottage. Mr. Weir was MP for Ross and Cromarty from 1895 until his death in 1911. And soon after his election, the brand new Lewis Hospital welcomed its first patient on the 1st of February 1896. A year later, in 1897, Mr. Weir had an interesting exchange in Parliament, the details of which are recorded in Hansard, under the heading Royal Naval Reserve, Stornoway. Question from Mr. Weir: I beg to ask the First Lord of the Admiralty whether, having regard to the fact that the largest Royal Naval Reserve station in the kingdom is in Stornoway, Isle of Lewis, and that no provision is made for the reserve men in the case of accident, will the Admiralty consider the advisability of making some contribution to the Lewis Hospital in Stornoway, seeing that it is the only hospital in the island where accident cases can be received, and is moreover maintained entirely by voluntary contribution? And the reply from Viscount Goshen, First Lord of the Admiralty: no case of injury requiring hospital treatment has occurred among Royal Naval Reserve men drilling at Stornoway since the Lewis Hospital was built. In the event of any man being hurt and requiring hospital treatment, he would be sent to that hospital at the usual rate of 2 shillings per day, and that would be paid for his maintenance. There is no reason for making a special contribution to the hospital. How times have changed. As we approach the centenary of the Isle Air disaster in 1919, with plans already in place to commemorate this tragic event, I return briefly to a photo taken on the Lewis Castle Green in the summer of 1919, showing Provost Murdo MacLean presenting the Royal Humane Society Medal and the Lloyd's Medal for Bravery to John Finlay MacLeod of Ness, father of John MacLeod, known as the boat builder, and grandfather of Ian MacLeod, currently of Churchill Drive. Now, since then, I was fortunate to get some excellent photos from Ian. And the first photograph shows the medals in their presentation box with the inscription Lloyd Silver Medal and Royal Humane Society Medal presented to Seaman John Finlay MacLeod, RNR, HMY Isle Ayr, with some 260 on board, mostly naval ratings, struck rocks near the entrance of Stornoway Harbour around 1 a.m. on January the 1st, 1919. Seaman MacLeod swam ashore with a rope line which enabled 40 lives to be saved. Tragically, over 200 others were lost. We can home in on one of the medals. This is one side of the Royal Humane Society medal with the inscription in Latin, Hoc Pretium Cive Servato Tulit. And the translation is, he has obtained his prize for saving the life of a citizen. Turning over the same medal, on the other side we have the Latin inscription, Latiat Scintillula Forsan, translated, a small spark may perhaps lie hidden. And the Roman numerals at the foot represent 1774, the year of formation of the Royal Humane Society. But the awards to John Finlay MacLeod did not stop there. Over in the family home in Ness, there is a certificate proudly displayed. In recent years, this certificate had come within the family to be linked in some way to one or both of the medals. However, my own research revealed that Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish-American industrialist, born in Dunfermline in 1835, had established the, I haven't got the name of it here. It's actually on the top of the picture, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission. And he established this in Pittsburgh in the USA following a colliery disaster which killed 181 men. And he donated $50,000 to the cause. After that, in 1908, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission spread over to Europe, and there were 10 locations in Europe, one of these being in the UK, and the base for the UK was in fact in Dunfermline. So this photo is of their first meeting in Dunfermline, and their objectives were to recognise civilian heroism and give financial assistance where necessary to people who have been injured or to the dependents of people who have been killed in attempting to save another human life in peaceful pursuits. And here is an actual photo of the certificate. The marks at the top are not damage, they're reflections from the camera flash. At the conclusion of this research, Ian MacLeod paid me a very nice compliment when he said to me, "You probably know more about my grandfather than I do." In April 2016, and back in the day, you may have seen this magnificent photograph of Stornoway. In the May edition, the editor published numerous comments, which had been submitted by Sandy Matheson, our Honorary President, by Malcolm, by myself, and by other members of the Society Committee. When a photo of this quality appears in newsprint paper, it is inevitably going to lose some of its detail and clarity. So I set about tracking down the owner of the original, and I found him in Oban. And without any prompting and arm twisting, I am pleased to report that Mr. Wilson Scott from Oban has donated the original, a serial numbered image by George Washington Wilson, to the Society. Anyone with an interest in Old Stornoway could spend a considerable time looking at specific features of the town, and tonight provides an opportunity to look at a few of these features using a screen image rather than via newsprint. So we just home in a wee bit and we move round the scene, starting from the left-hand side. Up at the back here, just above where I'm pointing, is the house called Rosebank on Church Street. and that time it actually started its life as a church manse. Over here, just in the corner, you can just see the top of St. Columba's Church, behind the building currently occupied by Manjudd Chartered Accountants, and St. Columba's Church was built in 1794. Down here, you can see the distinctive features, windows of Lodge Fortrose, 1767. Moving across, up here, quite clear, is the Stornoway Courthouse, built around 1840. And down here, the Stornoway Free Church, originally built in 1845, burnt down in 1850 and rebuilt soon afterwards on the same site. Right over here, we have a very old house, Arden Voer. The Feud Charter was signed by Lord Fortrose in 1760. So that's a very old one. Down on the front here, we have the Royal Hotel, extended in 1927. This is before the extension. And an interesting one over the other side, here, Martin's Church without the spire. Martin's Church was built in 1890 and the spire was added in 1911. The plume of smoke here, Sandy believes it is from the guano factory. Guano factory is to do with, what do they make the guano from, Malcolm?
From bird droppings.
Bird droppings, yeah. And it was, it came before the gut factory with its smells. Down on the corner here, we can see the sail loft. We've already mentioned the sail loft has been round about 1800, but possibly later. And just behind it, the Louis Hotel, 1829. But there were a couple of excellent finds in this photograph in the town centre. If you look at this building here and just get an idea of exactly where it is. This is in fact the building which currently houses the Golden Ocean Restaurant, and the building known previously as the Townhouse. But it's much smaller there, it's much lower. It doesn't have all the floors that it has now. And this is the only image we've ever seen of the building with that particular height. And then, the best of all, over here, the one which helped us to actually date the photograph. This is Cobden House on Cromwell Street, at the bottom of Church Street, which now on the corner houses Hebridean jewellery, and it used to have D.D. Morrison's on the other end. But there's something interesting about this picture, because you can see on the front of the building there is scaffolding. So, how old is the building? If you step across the road to the other side and look at the date plate, you'll see that the building is dated 1886. So, with scaffolding on the building, we speculate that this photo dates to around 1886 and that they're finishing off the building, but we don't know for sure. So what was Stornoway like in the 1880s? I cannot home in on 1886 precisely, but I can go back to Slater's Gazette or Slater's Directory of 1882. And that's where I come to the little piece of paper that I dished out to you. If I was to put some of these things up on screen, it would be extremely difficult to read them. So if you have an interest in what I'm about to say in the next couple of minutes, I would encourage you to try and follow the instructions that are on that wee piece of paper. A warning, it's unlikely to work effectively on a phone, and there may be download problems in some tablets, but I can assure you that it does work very, very effectively on a personal computer or on a laptop. So what was Stornoway like in the 1880s? It says that Stornoway was built around the bay in the form of an amphitheatre. The houses are neat and well built and have a clean appearance. A stranger entering the bay is forcibly struck by the imposing and magnificent appearance of the Lewis Castle, while immediately surrounding the castle there are pleasure grounds and walks, and they have been tastefully laid out. The months of May and June and July form the season for herring fishing, with between 800 and 900 boats, with a complement of up to 5 hands to each boat employed throughout the island. The export of herring from the island can reach 70,000 barrels in 1 year. The document features education, churches, banks, they all get a mention, and the detail on people and the local business is profound. It's very detailed. There are even 54 named persons, including clergy, who are described at the top of the section as the gentry. And it's interesting just to see who the gentry are. How many businesses do you think are listed in Stornoway? In Stornoway, not in Lewis, on these 4 pages. 316 identified businesses in Stornoway, including, and I'm looking at DL and John MacLeod here, 22 named boot and shoemakers and 18 named bakers. 22 boot and shoemakers and 18 named bakers. And it's now abundantly clear to me that the ancestors of people like D.L. Smith and John MacLeod saw a highly profitable market for their trades and products, resulting in the birth of the Stornoway millionaires. So as I say, if you wish to read this in detail, do it online, because the print on A4 paper is very small. And I've issued this guidance to you in the hope that you'll go online to read Slater's Directory and Gazette of 1882. Now, that's been a bit of a rush, folks, but I've managed to get here at 8:03, bearing in mind the hitches that we had earlier on. So I'd just like to close by saying, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes tonight's presentation on more snapshots from the Stornoway archive. I can promise you that the combined output from March and from tonight is still only scratching the edges of the rich archival history of the town of Stornoway and its hinterland. Thank you very much.